2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the backseat of the car next to his 2 older siblings, and his father was driving the car. And they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it, and there was this single-story home where they'd cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his 2 siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house, and they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway, and sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his 2 siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice, after the fact, they would say they noticed this, they started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house, and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat. And a number of adults saw him do that, but it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Mr. Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so he goes to the kids and he's like, hey, have you seen Rowan? And they're like, oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And then Mr. Griffin asks the adults and they say the same thing. Yeah, he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, hey, everybody stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is. And pretty quickly they realize he's not in the house. He's not in the backyard. He's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not here. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods. They're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking any chances. And so the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had ATVs and 4-wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally the sun does go down that night and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself. So very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet. But they were basically sludging through the swamp and it was very thick. And at some point they make their way through a clearing and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. And so they wade their way over and they climb up onto this dry section of land and they walk over and sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times and then they stop to listen. And after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling, here. And they walk their way past this huge bush and they look through and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately the searchers jump right in the water and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is. And the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest and they're looking around and it's at least that deep all the way around this thing. And they're looking up at the kid and he's bone dry and he's 2 years old. So they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents. And so they finally hop up onto this island and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up, they keep him out of the water, and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and, what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions. And they would say, what happened? How'd you get lost? And how'd you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything, but eventually he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows, and that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him, and he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him, being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman, who we'll call Olivia, met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had had some alcohol, but not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident. And so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later, they pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though. But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, hey, ma'am, have you been drinking tonight? And she would tell them that, well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours, and I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk. But the police were not buying it, and so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100, and while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 0.08% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 0.2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning, and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 0.4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, and so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. And so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again, and again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called autobrewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend, and he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains, and as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon, and about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived and 1,600 volunteers from the town that had heard about this, they all poured out onto the mountain and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up. We're going to find him. We're going to find him. And he thinks the dog's going to lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays on a complete beeline for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp. There wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8 a.m., an 8-year-old boy named David was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line and a boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over and it turns out it's Jerry Monkman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Like literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it. Nope, he couldn't have done it. And now clearly he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles, 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You make turns and you go left, there's switchbacks. And the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were going to hurt him, but they didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him, and he just kept saying, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. And so obviously this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer, and they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock, and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert. And as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. the weather on Bull Deer Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Bull Deer Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Bull Deer Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime, because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island, because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Bull Deer Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain, but short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything, and they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing, he's been here so long, he's probably just out exploring or something, but they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water, he's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they're like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water, because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Bull Deer Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder. Let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. So that's gonna do it, guys. On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards, and he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer. And then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around, and then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past, and then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed. And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards until 2009. That year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move, sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we gotta move. April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what? I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding and they had driven down this dead-end road, and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Ed Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched the samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty. But he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him. And there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section